Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Agencies will soon have new requirements for logging cybersecurity data to better secure their systems and data against ever-increasing threats. The Office of Management and Budget's new memo outlining these changes is one of several ways the Trump administration is recalibrating cyber defenses as the threat of artificial intelligence-fueled cyber attacks increase. For more on OMB's new memo and other changes, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller joins me now. Jason, great to have you.
Thanks, Terry.
Let's start with the OMB memo. What particular changes are they calling for here?
Our friends at OMB were very kind on a Friday afternoon, released this memo to really change and rescind how agencies are supposed to do logging requirements and really set a new set of expectations to do what they say minimizes red tape, contain costs. Now, Terry, the focus from this new OMB memo is I think, threefold. First, they want agencies really to focus on continuous event monitoring, something that they call CEM. And then they also want them to focus on for logging data of threat hunting, investigation, response, and forensics. The acronym there is THRIF. So, of course, we need an acronym for everything we do. And really, this does a couple things. As I said, the third piece of this is a new whole encountered architecture that kind of drives these changes. And that's going to be put together by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, with help, of course, from federal CISOs and, of course, the Office of Management and Budget's federal CIO's office. Now, first of all, they rescind the former logging memo from 2021, which really came out shortly after the SolarWinds attack, the SolarWinds incident, where they said, hey, we really didn't know what we had. We need to understand what we had. OMB says, listen, agencies have made a lot of progress. We're really excited for where they are, but we really need to move into more of a risk-based approach to logging because there's a lot of data, there's a lot of noise, and really let's figure out what works best. So I think that's the one big change is going from collecting everything to collecting very specific sets of data that agencies can then understand what's going on within their own environment. And the goal here is because of the volume, the velocity of cyber data that's coming, specifically from some of these AI-fueled attacks, it gotten too burdensome for a lot of agencies.
Jason, did they give the agencies a timeline to move to this new cyber logging approach?
Terry, what would a good OMB memo be without some good timelines, right? There's deadlines, there's requirements here. So let's just start with some basics. Within 90 days of the release of the memo, so from last Friday, CISA has to come up with what they call this logging reference architecture. The logging reference architecture really does a couple things. It's the strategy, if you will. It's this idea of how agencies can meet the objectives under the continuous event monitoring and the threat hunting, incident response, and forensics objectives. It also serves as the core guidance for how agencies can implement a lot of these logging capabilities. So then, after the release of that, agencies then have 90 days to come up with their first version of their agency logging plan. Now, this is the minimum requirements. And then things kind of continue along. 120 days to get basic level 1 of the maturity model. One of the things that OMB also did was update the maturity model that they initially put out back in 2021. Then they have 180 days to get to level 2 and 320 days to get to level 3 of the maturity model. We have all that laid out on federalnewsnetwork.com. You can find the story, the link to the memo and everything. But the upshot of all of this is, I think what OMB is saying is we realize logs are important. We realize that there's a lot of data coming in, and we have to find the right balance between which data is most important to understand what's going on inside your network and which you should collect, keep, and continue to look at. A lot of this will be handled by an agency security operations center.
You know, Jason, the federal agencies really don't do this all by themselves. They are in close partnership with cybersecurity companies who play a big role in defending networks and applications against these AI-enabled threats. Tell us a little bit more about how those relationships are being built between the federal agencies and private sector experts.
Logging is a great example of this, Terry, because logging requires tools and such that agencies have to use. And then so much of that logging is also happening in the private sector. Now, we've heard this tired expression that cybersecurity is a team sport. But given what we saw recently with, for instance, the Claude Mythos discovery of thousands of zero-day vulnerabilities in systems that maybe were previously unknown or not addressed, really forced agencies and industry to figure out how to strengthen this partnership. Nick Anderson is the acting director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. He's particularly worried about one type of technology when it comes to these cybersecurity vulnerabilities.
The open source community is one that I'm particularly worried about when we start to think about sort of the rapid escalation of vulnerability discovery. It is going to result in us having to make some really, really hard decisions on the level of investment that's going to be required. I think there's tremendous opportunity here to sort of re-architect areas where we know that they've been lacking, to make investments in areas where we know that we've been lacking, and to just force some hard security decisions to be made in a way where people thought that their risk profile was different than what it is. And when we see the escalation in terms of speed, scale, and velocity of vulnerability discovery to weaponization and exploitation, that's something that again, a month and a half ago, when everybody around here started talking about this is something we were already talking about with a lot of our stakeholders.
Anderson was speaking at the recent Cyber Innovation Summit sponsored by the National Security Institute at the George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. He says a lot of agencies face an uphill climb to get from under that technical debt he mentioned. And a lot of this technical debt includes a lot of these vulnerabilities. Now, Anderson says CISA and agencies have to modify their approach to vulnerability management, to coordinated vulnerability disclosure, and, of course, to remediation. He says the traditional ways to find and remediate vulnerabilities just no longer works.
We're looking at developing the right, even just contractual relationships, so we can make sure that we have the right relationships with companies that are going to be able to engage in a very substantive way with both critical infrastructure owner-operators and with federal system operators. And I don't necessarily want individual agencies and departments trying to think about how they're going to solve this problem on their own, or an owner-operator thinking about how they're going to try to solve this problem on their own. So we're looking at what are even the right sort of transactional relationships that we can establish to help make that as easy and as seamless, as possible for people as they begin to move forward. Additionally, when we start to look at some of our partnership elements, we're deliberatively working right now to prioritize critical infrastructure owner-operator entities that we can get to first.
Anderson pointed to a recent incident involving Cloudflare, which came in and actually shared with CISA what happened. He says they're very open, very communicative about what happened during their outage, while it was occurring, and when it was over. And then they came in and said, hey, we could maybe help you with a playbook for the future when others could learn from best practices for how to engage with CISA and the government during a cyber incident.
Well, speaking of these kind of partnerships, CISA and the Army and others got together a week or two ago to figure out how to ensure military bases are more resilient against cyber attacks. What did you learn about that new effort?
This is part of an ongoing effort from CISA really to focus on this resiliency of critical infrastructure providers. It's been ongoing for several years now. But in this case, CISA, the Army, and others created an intergovernmental approach, what they call the Homeland Defense Working Group. Now, in the last couple of weeks, a group of them, CISA, the Army Secretary, and senior staff members, even the FCC and others, traveled to Fort Bragg in North Carolina and started to talk through this Defense Critical Infrastructure Initiative. Anderson says the previous approach was to designate a company, a critical infrastructure provider, as part of a specific sector and say, hey, good luck. But what they all have realized over the last few years is that there's interconnections between the companies, between DoD, and the local community.
Where we're trying to get to now is saying there's a specific function that is critically important. In this case, for defense critical infrastructure, there's a specific function that needs to be delivered. How can we set real resilience targets associated with that? Otherwise, if I'm an energy sector company, it is impossible for me to be able to deliver to an appropriate resilience target if somebody doesn't tell me I need 80% of my normal base load because I'm in a time of crisis and I need to be able to get ready for troop deployments, or I need 20%, or I need 120% because I'm really going to have to scale up my operations, here on the base to be able to support that. It starts with being able to set clear targets for what does resilience even mean for these entities, and then ultimately talking about how do we invest appropriately alongside them. Whether that's in time, whether that's dollars, whether it is a fresh approach to how we're looking at Homeland Security grant programs, whatever it is, and really looking as an interagency team at where can we make the most impact to be able to achieve a higher level of resilience for defense critical infrastructure in particular.
Anderson says the DCI is really part of how CISA and the government more broadly is trying to partner at scale. He says this creates a unified effort that can lead to good quality understanding of what the real threat and risk landscape looks like, what are the problems everyone's trying to solve, and how really the government can provide, as you heard him say, more resources in a coordinated way. Anderson actually described how this intergovernmental approach is coming together.
To look at a good blue space view of what is it that's most significantly important to us. When we start to look at public health and safety, national security, defense critical infrastructure, and continuity of the economy. Then taking a good red space view of looking back at our intelligence holdings from the last several years and saying, this is our view of what we think is important. Here's what the adversary thinks is important. Where are we actually seeing them pre-positioned? Where are we seeing their activity? Where are we seeing them landing on the infrastructure that they believe is going to be most significant for achieving their objectives? Then looking at that overlap and saying, now how do we go engage with joint action plans with those companies directly? And some of those are technology companies. Some of those are critical infrastructure owner-operators. They would be able to achieve a higher minimum level of resilience overall. And again, not with the expectation that nobody's going to be impacted. Everybody in the world has cyber incidents. Everybody in the world has a vulnerability that's exploited. And being able to look at ease of recoverability and ease of normalized resilience metrics that are going to be able to get us there, that's really where we have to invest our time moving forward.
Terry, what this all comes around to is not just this idea that the government is pushing information out, that the government is accepting information in, but that partnership that we talk about so often. And these AI-enabled attacks really made the government rethink, how do we kind of stay ahead of them or at least keep up with them as they continue to increase and the threat landscape changes.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, really appreciate you summing all of these initiatives up for us here today.
Always a pleasure.
You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com.